I would like to now introduce our next speaker, who is Helena Bowen. She's a speaker coach, speechwriter, communication specialist, TED coach, etc. Helena is responsible for my TED Talk, and I need to say something about that because since last August, that talk has had around 1.7 million views. It's one of the most viewed, it might be the most viewed, I'm not sure, viewed archaeology talks that are currently on the TED website. That's not the important message. Whether you like the talk or not, and honestly, I can't stand to watch myself.
Nah.
I don't know if I've even gone through the whole thing in its final form. The important point is, by many orders of magnitude, more people will have viewed that talk than any of my academic papers. This is the way that as scientists, we need to reach a broader audience. This is how we get our message out. And as archaeologists, I'm just gonna get on my soapbox for 1 second. As archaeologists, we're some of the people that are best suited to talk about long-term impacts on environments. And we can make a significant contribution to climate crisis research. And we're not doing it because we can't get our message across. So that's the main reason that I asked Helena to come here and help us with some strategies on how to better communicate. And also, I know a lot of you are saying that I have more, and I have even more yet to say. A lot of you are saying, oh, I've been talking for years, I've given talks or whatever, I don't think I can improve myself or whatever. If you have a big talk and you hire a speechwriter, somebody to help you, it will pay dividends in terms of the quality of your talk and your audience reach. All right, I'm out.
Chris, that was such a good intro. Thank you. It's funny you mentioned all of that too. And I was actually going to say this at the end of the presentation, but of course, since you mentioned it, and now that we're here, I think one thing that was really interesting that happened to me this morning is I got a text from a speaker that I worked with in February. And she's an epidemiologist, associate social epidemiologist. I'll tell you a little bit more about her later. But she texted me to say that even though, of course, she's written all of these, papers, she's a professor, she has written for The Conversation, her TEDx talk was released online in April. And lo and behold, who sees it? The Biden administration. And then the Biden administration reaches out to her to come talk to them about COVID, and specifically long haul COVID. So Chris's point is totally accurate and very valid, that sometimes even when you're talking about something like the Biden administration, the best way to get your message out there is through a more popular channel. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But I want to start with a book that maybe some of you guys have read. It's called The Merchants of Doubt. Curious if you've read it. If you haven't, add it to your list. Came out in about 2010. And what really intrigued me about this book is it was all about how a handful of people, a handful of scientists with, I guess, the wrong intentions, had basically undermined decades and decades and decades and decades of research around tobacco and the harms of tobacco, of course, and around climate change, and how it took just a handful of people to completely, not wipe away the efficacy of that research, but really just diminish its potency significantly. And that book was super eye-opening to me. Of course, they made it into a documentary. The documentary is amazing as well. But the reason why it was eye-opening to me is I kind of always had this belief that good information would win the day, right? Like, as long as you put it out there, it's going to find the right people and the people are going to believe in it. And really what that book showed me is that there is a war going on, a war of information, which of course now we're abundantly aware of. And that is a war between, good actors, the scientists who have this great research they care about, they're really invested in it, they've put years or decades of their life into it. And of course, bad actors who have their own concerns, right? The only problem is that a lot of times the bad actors are better communicators. And that's how we end up with things like so much climate change denial, right? When I was working with Chris and the team on Facebook ads for this event and other Earth Archive related things, of course, we were getting just completely drowned in comments saying that climate change is a hoax and it doesn't exist, it's not real, why are we even doing this, that kind of thing. So we all know that contingent is there. They're alive and well. And a lot of that is because some of the messaging around climate change from the wrong side, so we should say, is better than ours, right? They've done a really good job of getting their message out there, and perhaps some climate scientists can do a better job of getting their message out there in the general public. Same thing, of course, with vaccines and autism, right? We've seen this to be a problem for the last decade, and it's a problem now more than ever with COVID, right? So many people are not getting the vaccine because of debunked research decades ago about a link between vaccines and autism. And then, of course, now there's just been a swirl of misinformation online, misinformation and disinformation about COVID, that we're still dealing with the effects of that from the lowest levels and the highest levels, and we'll probably be dealing with the effects of that for a long time. And you know what? There's probably about 600,000 people who are dead because of it, right? Because of that misinformation and disinformation in the US. So basically, why I'm here today is to help the right people, AKA you, scientists, academics, educators, people with the right intentions who care about facts, research, doing the work, communicate their message in a better way. My name is Helena, as Chris said. I'm a speaker, coach, and speechwriter. I came from an academic household. Both my parents are veterinarians, and so I spent all of my youth running around to veterinary conferences with both of them. That obviously was not my intention to come into this line of work. I actually started my career in Hollywood. And so really I merged that, academic kind of professorial sciencey background of mine as a kid with then the skill set of Hollywood. And in Hollywood, I learned really how to tell a story, how to communicate things to people, how to make people care about things. And then, of course, that now has led to a lot of my work with organizations like TED, TEDx, and the United Nations in communicating real world, awesome facts, statistics, data, important information that will truly change the lives of people in a way that is also entertaining. And I think that's one of my core beliefs, is it doesn't have to be one or the other. We can do both. It just takes a little bit of an effort. So today, in an effort to overcome this battle against disinformation and misinformation, I'm going to go through 3 of the biggest mindset shifts that I see scientists and academics having to make in order to better communicate with the public. And I'm also going to go through 3 tips and a bunch of examples. So here we go. All right. So let's start with the mindset shifts. So I have worked with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of academics and scientists and researchers at this point, of course, including my own parents. And there are 3 things that I see as being very important to, I don't want to say get over, but kind of change your mind on in order to really, really successfully communicate with the public. So the first one is that you're either talking to your peers or you're talking to the public, not both, right? This is one of the biggest mistakes that I see people making, and it's also one of the biggest hangups. I hear from so many researchers, I don't want to go speak at TED or TEDx because my peers are going to think I'm, ridiculous. They're going to think I'm self-serving. I have to include this information in my TED talk because otherwise my peers will think I'm crazy. They're going to think I'm not smart enough, things like that. First of all, side tangent, soapbox. Chris went on a soapbox, so will I. Academics need to be nice to each other. You guys are too mean. Academics tear each other apart, and I understand why, but I think it does everyone a little bit of a disservice because then so many researchers, so many scientists aren't willing to get out in front of the public because they're worried what their peers think. even though when we're talking about your peers, a lot of times for people who have PhDs who've been in a particular field or sub-subfield for decades, that's only a handful of people, right, in the world. So you really have to decide whenever you're about to give a presentation, am I giving this presentation for my peers, like a group of people who are true experts in the field, or am I giving the talk for the public? And then completely go in that direction. It's either one or the other. You truly cannot do both, right? So instead of asking, what will my peers think about this presentation, ask, is this even a presentation for them? I bring this up, in part, I see this in my own work all the time. I mentioned to you guys that I used to work in Hollywood, and anytime I see a TED Talk about Hollywood, to me, it always seems like so basic and boring and snooze-worthy, right? But then someone who's not from Hollywood, someone who didn't spend a decade in Hollywood, would see that same TED Talk and think, oh my gosh, this is so cool and so interesting, right? And that's just an example of, I'm not the right audience for that TED Talk, right? I already know all of that stuff. It's not for me, it's for someone else. So this would be, in that case, I would be the peer of that speaker. And, if I wanted to talk, I would have to go to something that's much more advanced. But there's no way, truly, there's no way to do both. So pick one or the other and then just roll with that. A really great example is I worked with the speaker, Christoph Keplinger, who is truly one of the world's biggest experts on artificial muscles for robots, right? Incredibly interesting and incredibly niche field. And I remember there was a huge struggle in the process of writing this script because, of course, there's a handful of people on the earth who are as much of an expert as he is. And he was very concerned, what they would say, what they would think, how they would react to his TED Talk. And we had to really come to the conclusion that it's not for them at all. And it kind of doesn't matter what they think. Because for the general public, you need to be speaking at a completely different level. And in the end, he came away, he definitely told me that he was amazed by how warm and supportive and nice and loving the general public is, because they weren't there to judge him, right? They weren't there to think like, is this accurate? Is this not? Like, where's the research? Show me your sources, whatever. The general public's not like that, right? They're really just there usually to receive, and they're either interested or not, which is how we end up with so much misinformation and disinformation, because the general public is not going to check your sources. They're not going to challenge you. So the bad actors, again, can say what they will and it goes unchecked. But on the flip side, it also means that you can walk into a speaking engagement with the general public, or you can walk into an interview on a podcast, you can walk into, an interview on the news, all those things, and just take the pressure off yourself, because you aren't going to have that audience of peers just scrutinizing your every move. It's really the public is excited and interested and eager to hear what you have to say. The next tip is to realize, and I know this is heartbreaking, that the public will not read your journal article, and that's totally fine. It was never meant for them. And if you want them to have that information, you're going to have to meet them where they're at. Of course, I use this photo of social media over here. It doesn't necessarily mean social media, but you have to recognize that at the end of the day, all of us people were tired, we're beaten down by a global pandemic and political chaos and all of that. And you really, if you want people to engage with your work in a deep way, you have to meet them where they're at, right? They are absolutely not going to log on to JSTOR at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday for fun. Honestly, I mean, some of you might do that. I think Chris does that, but I certainly don't. And so you're going to have to figure out how to get to them in another way. A great example of this, a talk that actually completely aligns with what Chris was talking about earlier, is Sarah Koenig's TED Talk called Aliens Built the Pyramids and Other Absurdities of Pseudo-Archaeology. She really talks in her talk about how easy it is for misinformation to spread about archaeology online, mainly because there's not a ton of great factual archaeology content out there, right? All of the most interesting archaeology content online is about things like aliens coming and building pyramids, stuff like that. Like, it's just Not great. So if we want people to be engaged in archaeology, we have to create stuff that's interesting for them and about archaeology. An example that I always use is, of course, growing up with two parents in medicine, we'd always get the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know if you are familiar with this magazine, but it has the world's most boring cover. It is a solid white cover, has been for decades, just has the title, contents in black font. That is one way of presenting medical information, right? That is a journal article. But then, of course, when I was working in Hollywood, I worked on a ridiculous TLC show called Sex Sent Me to the ER. You could technically have the exact same story in both of those places. One is for the peers, not for the general public, and one is completely for the general public. And it's not to say that one is different or one is better than the other, although I would obviously say that New England Journal of Medicine is better than Sex Sent Me to the ER. It's just to say that you have to format things differently if you want the public to actually engage, because the public will never engage with New England Journal of Medicine. There's absolutely no way. Sorry, anyone from New England Journal of Medicine. Next up we have, and I get this all the time, you're not dumbing it down, you're inviting in new people. I hear from speakers all the time that they don't want to risk dumbing down their information and having people not in, again, their peers think that they're ridiculous, right? Instead, you need to reframe the way that you're thinking about it and think, I usually think in terms of like college level courses or high school level courses, right? You would not teach a graduate level college course to a group of 8th grade students and then blame them for not understanding. When you're talking to the general public, you have to think of them much, much, much more as high school students or maybe even like college freshmen. You're really inviting them into your subject matter, whether your subject matter is archaeology, your subject matter is, technology, your subject matter is epidemiology. You need to talk at that lower level, not because they're stupid or whatever. It's just because they're not experts at all yet. You have to invite them in and scale up their knowledge before they're going to feel really comfortable. Adam Grant has a great quote. It's something like, great communicators make the audience feel smart. And I think that is why the TED brand has been so successful. When you look at most of the talks online, they're written at a 3rd, 5th grade level, which is shocking to most people. But I think that's why it's so successful, is because people feel smart when they watch them. They feel like they've learned something new, and maybe then they want to read your book and they want to engage a little more and they want to watch another talk that you did online for an hour. You're really inviting them into this conversation by writing at a simpler level. A great example of this is Carson Bruns, who gave a phenomenal talk. I love it so much. If you guys want to have fun, just go check out this talk. It's really about medical tattoos. And he's both a expert in, biomechanical, nanotechnology, I don't know, nanobiomedical engineering, something like that. Clearly, I'm not a scientist in that regard. And he gave a talk on tattoos. Now, the talk that he wrote is so fun, so simple, so basic. It does not require any sort of college level degree to understand it. And it has been so popular because it's really gotten people engaged in this topic that they otherwise never would have considered even thinking about. He really made this hard to understand concept both simple and fun for the audience, and it's been incredibly popular as a result. So those are the 3 biggest mindset shifts. Feel free to screenshot this, that I want you to overcome when you're talking to the public. Is 1, you're either talking to your peers or the public, not both. Pick and choose for each engagement. Number 2, the public will not read your journal article, and that's okay, right? You're going to have to reformat it for them in some other way. Kind of like how, a great example, of course, is the Earth Archive. Chris, Steve, so many people have published all of these academic articles. And then you have Doug Preston's book, which is more geared towards the general public. You have Chris's TED Talk, also geared for the general public. It's not that one thing or another is bad. but I would, or bad or good, but I would bet a lot of people came to this conference today, and I bet a lot of people have donated to the Earth Archive because they came in through Doug's book, or they came in through the TED Talk, and then they had a deeper level of understanding and wanted to engage more. And finally, you're not dumbing it down, you're inviting in new people, as I just said. So next, I'm going to give you 3 of my top tips for better science communications. Number 1 is to make it relevant to their life. Again, this goes back to the fact that no one is just going onto JSTOR at night to look up journal articles for fun in their free time. Maybe a few people, not a lot. So you really need to make it clear right from the get-go why they should listen to you in the first place. And this is where it comes in really handy to talk to friends, talk to family members, talk to your kids, find out what about your work is most interesting to them. Because a lot of times it's not what you find most interesting. And that's fine. When you're talking to your peers, you can talk about what you find most interesting. But when you're talking to the public, you need to make it relevant to their life. So let me give you a few examples. Oh my gosh, how familiar, Chris Fisher. So of course, most of you here today watching me right now came to this conference because you have a vested interest in geospatial technology. Maybe you're a scientist, a researcher, maybe you're an archaeologist, right? You are all subject area experts. But of course, when Chris was giving his TED Talk, we knew that the majority of people watching would not be in any of those fields. They would not be experts by any stretch of the imagination. So we made his idea relevant to their lives by connecting it to their legacy and what is going to happen to your children's grandchildren, right? What's going to happen to them in the climate crisis? That's how we made this, perhaps abstract idea to them. I would bet that most people in the audience had no idea what LiDAR was before they entered the auditorium, but we made it really relevant to them. We also made it relevant to them by focusing on some of the fun, adventure-y, cool stories from Chris's archaeological work that they would immediately be engaged in. If we had just started with LiDAR scanning the planet, they would have been like, I don't know what you're talking about at all, and I'm going to just disengage. Another example is Chris Lowry, who I worked with him on a talk about, it's really about the microbiome, but we made it super relevant to people's lives by giving them actual things that they could do right now today to improve their gut bacteria, right? So even though for him, he's perhaps more interested in the long-term implications of pharmaceutical interventions, medicines that can be developed that would change people's microbiomes, we made this talk way, way more relevant to the general public who can just do something like eat more vegetables, right? At the end of the day, the take-home message of this entire talk is just eat more plants. But the TED Talk did well, and then it got millions and millions and millions and millions of views on TikTok of all places, because it was so relevant to people's lives that they were just obsessed. They couldn't get enough. And I'm sure it's had a huge impact. And of course, one of my favorite examples of all time, making it relevant to people's lives. I don't know if most people know that they're interested in the sex lives of fish, but I would guess that you are, now that I mention it. So this talk, interestingly, is actually about climate change. The whole talk is about how us disrupting the ocean water is disrupting fish reproduction, right? But when you just sit down and try to talk to someone about climate change, as you may or may not have noticed, a lot of people in the general public don't want to do that. So we actually started with something that's way more relevant to them, which is fish, the oceans, right? Most people have been to a beach. Most people have been to an aquarium. And so we made it really fun and relevant to them, and then said, oh, guess what? This is actually about climate change. And by then they were so invested, this talk has nearly 2 million views at this point and is incredibly popular, I think, because we made it relevant to them first and then talked about why it matters. Number 2 is give them something to talk about, right? The old song. So one of the reasons misinformation spreads so fast is that it's simple to understand and it's really easy and fun to talk about, right? So one of the best things that you can do in your science communications is find the fun facts, the interesting bits, the interesting stories that will make your research less dry, right? A lot of times academic research is presented in a really dry way, but if you can include those fun details, fun facts, whatever, the audience will remember that. They will tell their friends will go look up your talk, their friends will go look up the podcast. And that's how you kind of build a groundswell of support, is you almost want the audience to be gossiping about your talk, right? I didn't use that word because I knew there might be an allergic reaction to the phrase gossip, but you guys know what I'm talking about. You want people to gossip about your information, your research after they leave the conference or the podcast or whatever. So here's a few examples of that. I worked on this talk with Allie Anderson, who is a engineer, and she was talking about engineering a better spacesuit, basically, which, you know, is already kind of interesting in its own way, but we included all sorts of crazy, weird details about spacesuits in the talk so that people would remember them and then talk about it with their friends, and their friends tend to talk about it and whatever. The thing that I will never forget from that talk is that it's a very common injury in a spacesuit to rip off your fingernails because of the way the gloves are designed. See, I'm already talking to you, and now you're going to go talk at home to your spouse and your kids about spacesuits ripping off your fingernails. Trust me. So just including those few little details in her talk made it that much more shareable. Another great example is Kim Gorgan's The Surprising Connection Between Brain Injuries and Crime. Now, she is like one of the world's foremost experts on brain injuries and the science around that. But this talk has a very, very, very little actual neuroscience. Instead, we made it much more about crime and how crazy high the rates of brain injuries in prison are, right? The incarcerated population. And that gives the audience something to talk about. It makes it that much more easy for this talk to spread. This talk also has millions of views. And then for the people who do want to know more about the neuroscience, they can follow up with one of the many, 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 many journal articles or lectures that Kim has online. And another example, K-Tai, what investigating neural pathways can reveal about mental health. This talk is another hardcore neuroscience talk, right? She and I did so many calls and I had no idea what she was talking about most of the time, but she had some really cool, interesting videos from her research. And it was mice who were being affected by, light, and they were completely changing their mental state. Those videos were enough to get the audience talking and sharing with their friends. And this talk has done shockingly well. I actually cannot believe how well this talk is doing, considering how complicated the subject is actually is. And then my final and last tip for you today, when in doubt, retrace your steps. The scientific process is basically storytelling, right? You have been through this process, if you're a scientist, that has led you to a result, right? You start with a question, you investigate it, you iterate it, and you come up with a result. And of course, the most journal articles are written in reverse, right? You're immediately revealing what the answer is. What I'm simply saying is just retrace your steps in your communications, because people love hearing about that process. And in fact, I always remind people that the scientific process is almost identical to a detective story, right? Detective shows are so popular, like this one here, True Detective. Have you seen it? It's incredible. But all detective stories start with a question: who killed the person, right? And then they're going through the process of uncovering evidence and studying the evidence, and eventually they come to a result. It's the exact same thing as the scientific process. So if you just retrace your steps instead of giving an answer, it immediately makes it that much more interesting. One final example is a talk by Ethan Mann, How Sharks Inspired a New Generation of Medical Devices. And he literally just retraces the steps of the company of looking at sharks, observing the texture of their skin, realizing that sharks have this kind of antibacterial way about the texture of their skin, like bacteria cannot stick to it because of its structure. Thinking like, oh, can this be applied to medical devices? Applying it to medical devices, yes, it does work. Yes, it does prevent bacteria from sticking to medical devices. If he just came out and said, hey, we invented this new kind of catheter that doesn't have bacteria stick to it, I mean, certainly there's some people that would be interested in that, but it's way, way, way more interesting to start at the beginning with that initial observation and question of, like, why aren't sharks covered in bacteria like a whale or a manatee, right? Same thing, I mentioned her at the beginning, Margot Gage Whitfilet. She just retraced her steps from day one of getting COVID and what that was like as an epidemiologist. So my top 3 tips in a nutshell. Number 1, make it relevant to their life, the audience's life, the general public's life, not your peers' life. Number 2, give them something to talk about. Let them gossip about your research. Give them something to say to your husband. And number 3, when in doubt, retrace your own steps and just reshare your own scientific journey. So I hope that helps. Of course, if you have any questions, I will be available online. You can find me everywhere at Helena Speaking. And Chris, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Helena, and thanks for agreeing to do that and participating in the Earth Archive and creating that TED Talk. And I should say that when I did the TED Talk, it was actually, I don't know how many academics and talks I've given in classes, whatever. But the TED Talk was one of the hardest things I think I've really ever done, was reshaping the way that I gave those talks to make it understandable, and also fighting Helena every step way to do that. And there was one memorable occasion where Helena basically told me to get my act together, because I was having, I think
that is what I said,
memorizing my talk. He actually said something a little different.
Did I say something meaner?
It was
it was probably a little bit more mean.
I can't repeat it here.
That's fair. Yeah, this is a PG event from what I understand.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Chris.
In the end, it was awesome. And thank you so much, Helena, for agreeing to speak with us.
Sure. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. Farewell.